The early 20th century was all about big, bold, new ideas for how to plan and deliver cities. Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and the Bauhaus school. These were three philosophies which in some ways are complementary to each other, but in other ways are very different. And each of these three movements has been incredibly influential in the 20th century, and we continue to borrow from all three of these. Frank Lloyd Wright developed a particular vernacular, what he called Prairie Style, a way of making architecture but also urban growth mimic the landscape around it and incorporate elements of nature, also borrowing heavily from Eastern principles. Meanwhile, Le Corbusier, the French architect, had a very different vision for modernity and what modernity should look like. Le Corbusier's modernist style featured high-rise, high-density urban forms, a much more utilitarian architecture surrounded by parks and open space. And finally, the Bauhaus school, which developed in Germany in the 1920s, saw a combination of philosophy, politics, art, architecture, design, and urban planning combine. Frank Lloyd Wright was an architect based in the Midwest, but he was hugely influential for urban planning. So on the left, you can see Canberra, Australia, which was not directly planned by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was planned by one of his proteges, Walter Burnley Griffin, according to Wright's principles. On the upper right is his typical prairie house. This is a house in Oak Park, Illinois. So you can see in both of these examples the way that Wright brings the landscape, brings nature very much into central focus in his planning. And that was really central to Frank Lloyd Wright's approach to space. So for the prairie, the horizontal nature of the building form mimicked the flat landscape of the prairie. And in any Wright design is an interplay between natural elements and the built. For Canberra, Australia, which was a purposely planned capital in the early part of the 20th century, the landscape is central. This is the Australian bush, the edge of the outback, a semi-arid place of plains and hills, and Canberra very much designed alongside rather than against the landscape. Frank Lloyd Wright had a coherent vision for cities and city planning. This is a sketch of his 1935 work, Broadacre City. For Frank Lloyd Wright, decentralizing and space was really, really important, rather than density and everyone living on top of each other. For Broadacre City, each U.S. family would be given a 1-acre plot of land from federal land reserves. And Wright conceived his community would be built from scratch around this principle. So this wasn't exactly transit-oriented in the sense that it was spread out, but in other ways, there was a certain sustainability to it in the way that each family would have a plot of land to grow food. So it was a mix of unsustainable living combined with sustainable living. This is another diagram of Wright's Broadacre City. And there's a train station and a few office and apartment buildings, but the apartment dwellers, those living in high densities, were expected to be a minority. Most people would have been expected to live in single-family houses, again, spread out on 1-acre plots. The important transportation, Frank Lloyd Wright imagined, would be done by car. This was not particularly designed around the pedestrian. It's easy to look back now and think that pedestrians are right and cars are wrong, but remember that at the time, in the 1920s and 30s, personal car ownership was a really new thing. And so people believed, like Frank Lloyd Wright, that it was important to embrace the car. This was a new and in many ways a liberating technology. Le Corbusier, the French architect based in Paris, had a very different vision for modernity. His vision was not sentimental. It did not incorporate necessarily historical architecture or work with the landscape, but rather it regulated and controlled the landscape. His towers in the park was a vision for people to live in symmetrical, high-rise buildings that were sleek and utilitarian, alongside parks and open space, and you can see highways and wide roads connecting these areas. So this was also embracing the car, but in a very different way. But unlike Wright, this was not sentimental about either architecture or landscape. This was Le Corbusier's plan for Algiers, which was then a French colony. This was never realized, but you can see the way that the city in North Africa was redesigned along modernist principles. Meanwhile, the Bauhaus school developed in 1920s Weimar Germany, which incorporated utopian and socialist principles into a new vision for both design and planning that eliminated the hierarchies and divides between social classes. That was really central to the Bauhaus. And in doing so, architectural and design hierarchies also needed to be done away with. So the Bauhaus was all about clean lines, spaces that were not elevated around each other, angles, semicircles. The Bauhaus was an architectural and planning movement. It was also a vision and a lifestyle. This would be very influential because many of the leading minds in the Bauhaus movement needed to leave Germany as the Nazis gained power. This was seen as a degenerate form of thought and philosophy. So people like Mies van der Rohe would end up in Chicago and go on to shape many buildings in Chicago and also New York City. Bauhaus would also be very influential in parts of the colonial and post-colonial Global South, with major Bauhaus-influenced residential designs in places as varied as Tel Aviv and Singapore. So you can see the White City on the left in Tel Aviv. This is an early Bauhaus. This is an early part of Tel Aviv designed around Bauhaus principles, and the Tiong Bahru residential development in Singapore, both from the 20s and 30s, both with Bauhaus-inspired aesthetics. Le Corbusier's designs would also be incredibly influential around the world. One of the best examples of that is the Brazilian capital city, Brasilia, which was designed according to modernist principles by architect Oscar Niemeyer. And so you can see how closely Brasilia, which is now a city of several million people, follows Le Corbusier's idea of towers in the park.